My name is Colleen Curlee-Malament. Do you want me to spell it? My name is Colleen Curlee-Malament. I'm 31 years old. I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia. So what's funny for me when I think about my experience, I don't say that I grew up in the church. My grandparents lived in Atlanta, and they were involved in a Methodist church, so we would occasionally go there for Christmas and Easter, things like that. It wasn't until middle school time that my family actually committed to a church, and we started going to a cooperative Baptist church in Atlanta. I say that to distinguish from the Southern Baptists. The cooperative Baptists actually broke away from the Southern Baptists on the issue of women and leadership and a couple of other issues as well too. But it was overall it was a good experience. And what's funny for me is at the Methodist church, the Methodist church elevates women in leadership. They ordain women. And at the Baptist church, it was never an issue. Like, it was never even something on my radar. It's actually, I think I was a little, I guess I'll use the word like blissfully ignorant. Like, I had no thought that women were not allowed to show up in different spaces in the church, because in the church context that I was a part of, it was a non-issue. I mean, maybe it was, but to my understanding as a middle school through high school, I saw women up front. Our youth minister was a woman when I was in high school. Students were allowed to serve during big church. Didn't matter your gender, as long as you were excited and knew what to do and you could be taught. Then that was what we did. And so when I went to college, I didn't go to a Christian university, but I went to a private school that has a strong Christian population. It's a place called Berry College. And they have a chaplain's office on campus, and it was led by a male chaplain and a woman chaplain. And so again, it was this sort of equal elevation of women. And I watched our associate chaplain go through the ordination process to become a deacon in the Anglican church. So that was all good. I mean, truly unaware, I think, of all of the discourse and research and arguments about my existence in the church, because I don't know, it was never an issue. And then I moved to Nashville, and I started going to a PCA church, and I loved it. And I was a small group leader, and I read scripture for, like, as part of worship. I was so involved, and I loved it. And I had this very transformative experience, I think, as many students do when you leave college and you're figuring out who you are in your early 20s and having to wrestle maybe with your faith on your own for the first time outside of these supportive contexts you've been in. And that was true for me. So I was working in the music industry, doing videography, and sort of living what to me felt like a double life. I was living this very, my workplace was very secular, very just kind of, elevating of like celebrity status and all of these different things. And then I was helping lead a small group, and I was really growing in my faith, and I was being really well discipled by this church. I thought, oh my gosh, this is incredible. I think I want to go to seminary, which is funny because when I was in high school, I had gone to this summer camp that we'd gone to with our church. And it was one of those camps, like, we all took over a college campus for a week in the summer, and you got to pick a different track. So there was like people who did theater and people who did sports and people who did missions. And then there was a track for people who thought they wanted to go into ministry. And I ended up in that track and learned about spiritual disciplines and different ways of baptizing people. It was very ecumenical, like different ways of baptizing people, different ways of serving the Eucharist, and how different traditions think about that. And I can remember writing down in my journal as a high schooler, I think I want to go to seminary, having no concept really of what that is, but knowing that like, I like this ministry thing. I think there's something here for me. And then obviously I pursued psychology when I was in school. Public relations, I got kind of distracted by lots of different things. But then, so I'd graduated, I was working in the music industry, but growing in my faith. And I thought, that kind of came back to mind. It's like, I think I'm going to go to seminary. So I quit my job in the music industry and started looking for seminaries to go to. And I knew I wanted to stay in Nashville. I'd started to put down roots here. It didn't make sense for me to go back to Atlanta. My family had moved away at that point. So I was like, I'm in Nashville. And I remember I got connected with a student who had graduated from the MDiv program here at Lipscomb. And I said, well, I'm thinking about seminary. I know there's Vanderbilt down the road, and then that Lipscomb school. I didn't know much about either program, honestly. And the student said to me, well, you should go to Lipscomb, because as a woman, I've never been told no, I can't there. And it's been such a good experience for me. I've been so encouraged. And I feel like there was a little question mark that I'm like, what do you mean? I mean, truly unaware. And then I started trying to ask our pastor at the PCA church, oh, I'm thinking about going to seminary, and I got this kind of weird reaction. And then the doors opened up, like, oh, if you're going to do this, there's a fight happening, and you need to have a metaphorical dog in the fight. And it was so confusing and painful, It was like, wait a minute, I've done all of these things, and I felt very bait and switched, and so that was really challenging, I think. But never did that make me doubt my place, but it just hurt. In my opinion, it hurts the witness of the church in some ways when we're not allowing women, to be. And so I was trying to ask questions and understand. And so for me, it was a very confusing experience. But then I did go to seminary here at Lipscomb, and my cohort was 12 people started in the program. 6 were men, 6 were women. I mean, it was really beautiful split. And then I started hearing the stories of other women in my cohort about the traditions that they'd grown up in, the experience that they had had, where past a certain age, they're not allowed to speak up in class or to take on leadership roles, and seeing that, how painful that was, and yet they're still there. So anyway, it was just this wild experience. So, and I'll just say, I think for me, so I graduated with the MDiv in 2020. So that was a challenging time in ministry in general. But then looking for a church and trying to find my denominational home was challenging. I'm not Church of Christ. I didn't know what the Church of Christ really was before I came to Lipscomb. I didn't think that would be where I would land. And then it kind of became this game of well, what do I do? I've since ended up in the Anglican Church of North America, which is a complicated denomination in itself, because some dioceses in the Anglican Church in North America do ordain women to the priesthood and the diaconate. Some only ordain to the diaconate, some don't ordain at all. And there's still tension and conversations even being had within the denomination. So it's a weird place to be. But what's funny is I think I keep trying other things as far as pursuing my calling. And ministry seems to be the only thing I keep coming back to. So I think even in the midst of all of those challenges, it's still worth it. I think early on, I can remember in our church youth group, I was not very plugged in because we joined late. There were lots of students who'd been there since preschool. And so the dynamics there were a little bit weird. But I do remember our youth leaders and volunteers really pouring into me and entertaining my questions, investing in me in a way that I felt comfortable and safe continuing to go to that youth group, even if I didn't feel like I connected with the other students as well. But I can remember being at some of those summer camp experiences, and this feels like such a millennial Christian thing, but it was true. Those summer camp experiences were incredibly formative for me, because I think it gave you the chance to get outside of your comfort zone and all those things. But I can remember winning camper of the week and being given this opportunity to, at one point I was given the opportunity to tell my testimony in front of the whole camp. And I remember working with our youth minister as a woman about that and what that looked like. And so I think there were even things that, I don't think I recognized maybe how formative that was in the moment. It was just a cool opportunity, and I was excited and on fire for the Lord. And so I think there were people in my corner who just saw my energy and enthusiasm, and that this was a place that I was excited to be and thriving, and they chose to lean into that and to not squash that energy. So I think that's some of it. in college, having her name's well, she's a doctoral, and now she's a deacon in the Anglican church. But the Reverend Dr. Erin Moniz was super formative in my experience, like seeing her as a woman in leadership, even if I didn't know that was that significant. But just having those models, I think, was super important. But then when I was in the MDiv and really starting to wrestle with these questions and trying to figure it out, do you want me to use specific people? Okay, so Dr. John York was our professor for our Gospels class, and he saw the makeup of our cohort. We had 6 women, 6 men, and I think originally on the syllabus we were supposed to be writing some papers and things like that. And I remember, so either the first or second day of class, he was like, "Okay, forget what the syllabus says. You guys are gonna preach. Y'all are gonna preach for all of your tests. Like, this is gonna be what you do, because I want you all to have the opportunity to do that." And that was the first time I'd ever written a sermon. Was actually in this room to my cohort. It was like, okay, now what? And so, I mean, and that was a terrifying, challenging experience. I'd never done that before. I'd never, instruction on how to do that outside of being in school. And I did it. And I remember my cohort saying, "You did that really well." Like, we were, it was met with positive reception. And obviously I still had a lot to learn, but it was, to me, that's sort of an Ebenezer moment of, okay, I was given the opportunity to do this and I got to try it. And if I had fumbled and failed, like, okay, maybe there's something there too. But but it was that, and that was such a cool experience to continue getting to do that. And which was quite funny too, because when I was in the MDiv, we had practicum. We had to be in a church setting, or ministry setting for each of the 2 years of the program I was in. And my first year, I worked for a PCA church plant, because those were my connections, and that was the job I was able to get. And I was an administrative assistant for a church plant, and that is not my gifting. I very quickly realized that. Bookkeeping, not my gift. And it was so frustrating. And, obviously there was a level of, they had a job that needed to be done. I was doing that. But even in my questioning and pushing and trying to can I practice these ministry things that I'm learning in the class? Can I try to do this? Can I try to do this? And I wasn't really given the opportunity to do so in that context. And so that was this very stark contrast. Then, because I just swung the pendulum the opposite way, my second year in the program, my practicum was at a Glencliff United Methodist Church, which is a really unique congregation in itself. At the time, it was run by 2 part-time female pastors who were also running nonprofits on the side, very social justice oriented. The congregation is a mix of the community and the neighborhood and these people who've lived in Nashville for years and years, who've just committed to this church, and then a population of significantly high need, a lot of them coming out of homelessness, struggling with substance abuse, addiction issues. This congregation that had kind of been transplanted there from another Methodist church that had closed. And so it was this weird mashed up situation of people. But because it was run by these 2 part-time pastors, they more or less told me, whatever you want to do, you can do it, because we're all strapped for time and energy and resources. So I got to preach monthly, and they said, "You want to lead us a Bible study or a Sunday school class? Go for it. We empower you to do that." And that was just, jumping in first. So, I kind of had to learn confidence just to keep up in some of those ways. So it's a wild ride.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
So cool.
Yeah. I guess one more thing I'll say too, in my current context, in the Anglican church, when I joined, I was pretty quickly identified by our then youth minister, who asked me to join the youth team and be on the teaching team. And so I've gotten to teach for our youth group. We have a girls retreat for our high school and middle school girls, and I've gotten to help write the curriculum for each year and do all that. And I remember very early on in our time there too, that youth minister sat down with me and he said, "Do you ever thought about ordination?" Just sort of passed me the papers. He said the instructions for thinking about. He said, "I think you need to think about this." So I'm really thankful for folks who've just taken the initiative. I think, so as I'm learning and as I was learning kind of about, oh, there's this whole discussion about what women are allowed to exist in different leadership roles within the church. I think very early on, my reaction to those passages was, it was pretty hurt, and it was shocking because, again, it was so contrary to my lived experience. So I was growing in my biblical literacy, but I was like, well, I know, okay, I'm trusting these people who have allowed me to do these things. So that is very confusing. And I think probably, Paul gets a really bad rap in some ways for those verses. Definitely a lot of, and even still, I, can feel like there's a little bit of like dismissiveness or, well, Paul's just a jerk and I just gotta write him off, or, definitely these strong reactions because it was just so at odds with the narrative I've been told my whole life. So I think there's that as just a gut, like initial first reaction. And then actually after spending time at that whole year at that PCA church plant where I can remember their pastor sought to be kind and helpful. I remember he gave me a book about women's roles in the church that I don't think I read because I was mad about it. I was like, read, just so in the middle. But what I learned from that experience that I think helps me approach those passages with a sense of hospitality is that ultimately we will assume positive intent. I think most people are not evil woman hater, misogynistic, all the things that you could just easily, label and write those people off. I think it's folks who are seeking to be true to scripture. They're trying to interpret to the best of their ability. They're seeking to be faithful, to scripture. And there's a level of trying to honor the authority that scripture has. And so even though I think is problematic when women are not allowed to be in leadership roles, I can kind of understand it in a way. Like I know what you're trying to do, what you're probably trying to do. So there's that. With those different passages, something that's been super helpful for me is this organization called Christians for Biblical Equality. Have you heard of it?
No.
So cbeinternational.org. It's an organization that publishes scholarly articles. They have a magazine, they have a podcast, and it's an organization made up of theologians and scholars and pastors and advocates and activists kind of around the world advocating for mutuality, not complementarianism, not egalitarianism, but like mutuality, equality between men and women in all frames of the church. And they do a lot of work in this regard to help us understand, okay, what is the biblical context when we read those passages? And we could get into the nitty-gritty of it. But I think what's helpful to understand about those passages is, biblical scholarly literacy is super important. Translation is super important. Who's at stake when we read these passages in those particular lights is important to consider. And it doesn't mean that we write off scripture or we just say, well, if you don't have an MDiv or a doctorate, you can't understand scripture. But I think there's a level of continuing to recognize and continuing to remember that the scriptures were written in a very different time period and different culture than what we're in today. And so how do we take that lens and that historical approach to try to understand what scripture is telling us? I think one of my favorite pieces of church art, and I'm not going to remember her name, but there's a piece of church art, and it's Eve and Mary meeting. I think it was created by a nun, but that picture of Mary and Eve meeting, I think to me really represents like the upside down kingdom and the great reversal and the plan that God has for everyone. And so I mean, they're both incredibly important, and I think for me, Eve is someone who maybe at first it's like she gets pinned as the bad guy. And then you start reading the scripture over and over again, and you recognize that Adam is there with her at all times, and that they are jointly together, whether you believe they're actually Adam and Eve or just sort of, words that encapsulate all of humanity. This, Adam and Eve are both a picture of the elevation of humanity as the image of God, and they both have authority as, priests to the garden, and then they're called to steward the land and to care for it and to care for one another. And even the fact that it's not told to us that they don't work together to talk about what's happening with the serpent and the trickery and all of that. I think I have a lot of compassion for Eve. And just, yeah, I mean, she makes one mistake, and but not, it's like her and Adam together make that mistake, and all of those things. So, yeah, I have a lot of compassion for her. And Mary, of course. I mean, the Protestants always don't, we just don't give Mary enough credit for everything that she did. There's the podcast that the CBE International Organization puts out called Mutuality Matters. There's this hilarious episode, and they're talking about Mary, and they start off, referencing the famous song "Mary, Did You Know?" They're like, she did know. It's called the Song of Mary. Like, it's in scripture. She sings a whole song about it. And she did know, and she was consenting and accepting of what God asked her to do. And that narrative, oh my gosh. I mean, if we don't elevate that, just the impact for women worldwide, that you can, she had the choice. God said, will you? And she said, okay. Yeah. And so that, and her seeking to be faithful. So those are some of my initial thoughts about just, this is kind of this is a super relevant question for me in the tradition that I'm in. Our Archbishop has stepped down. There's been imprisonment brought against him about some issues of misconduct. And so there's a lot of questions about authority. What does it mean to hold authority well? How do we vet people who are in authority? All of these different things. So, and I think what's interesting when we think about authority is it's sort of this idea of optimism that we could get it right ever. If we just put the right people and we put the right safeguards and we vetted them and we did all of the background checks possible and could just do all these things, then maybe we wouldn't have issues where people in authority misuse their power. And I think the unfortunate thing about living in a world that is infected with sin is that there's always going to be people that are fallible. Right? People will always mess up. Even Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they had perfect communion with God, and they've taken power. They have sought to exercise authority and taken something that was not given to them. I mean, that's a problem of authority right there, and overreach and all of those things. And so, that's continuing through. So if we can't be entirely optimistic that we're gonna fix it, then we have to turn to something else, maybe Christian hope, that even in our fallibility, God is the ultimate authority, and God is in control. God is seeking to redeem the world and bring things to their ultimate redemption under the one authority of the Lord. And so we do the best that we can. We try to put safeguards in place, and we do check people, and we background check them, and we try to assess their character. And I think what's really important for someone who's in authority is that they're not isolated. We're not meant to do things alone in general, particularly someone in authority. Someone, what I want for my pastor maybe is a better way to try to answer this question. What I want for my pastor is time of Sabbath rest. I don't want them to get burned out. I want them to have a support system of people that they can confess their questions and sins to, who can hold them accountable. I want them to be prayed for. I want them to be theologically competent and educated. Um, yeah, but I think they need to be cared for too. And I think probably where some of the issues of authority really get messy is when we elevate someone in authority to the point of idolatry, and then they're isolated, then they can't do the things that they're meant to do. Like, even if you're in authority, you still have to be cared for by the people that you're shepherding, and vice versa. So I think those are some things that I think are important when we think about authority. And ultimately, authority is given by God. And it's not something to be taken lightly. And it's also not something to be taken and used, you know. Yeah. You have to maintain a soft heart and all that. So, yeah. I feel like in all of my conversations that I've had with my parents as I've talked about my theological journey, they always talk about like Mary Magdalene going to run and tell the disciples that Jesus has been resurrected. Um, and so I like love her and her redemptive story, her passion, her enthusiasm, and her commitment to God. And so, yeah, I think she's really glad that she's part of the biblical narrative. It's probably the first reason something comes to mind.
Yeah.